This is second reading on legal status of our facilities. Is there any discussion, comments, questions? Do I have a motion?
Do we need a motion?
Yeah.
So,
Move the governing board adopt proposed revisions to policy AA dash school district legal status.
Is there a second?
second.
All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed? Motion passes 4-0. The next item is legislative and political report. Mr. Jewett.
I think the largest, biggest item out there right now is the state budget. The just to go over this very briefly, the governor had proposed increased funds for capital, as well as some increased funds for to help schools with early reading to meet the requirements of the Move On When Reading that's coming out. The legislature yesterday afternoon, on a holiday, released a budget that was to be heard in Appropriations Committee this morning at 8 a.m. and was heard this morning at 8 a.m. So with 18 hours notice on a holiday, and it is at this point both houses have been having informational hearings on different state agencies and what it is they do and what their budget situations are. In the House, they have permitted public testimony. In the Senate, they have not, in the Senate Appropriations Committee. So the Senate Appropriations Chair said this would be the one chance that people would have to have public testimony down at the legislature on what the budget was, and 18 hours of notice was given on a holiday for that, for an 8 a.m. hearing. So I didn't follow it closely today. My understanding, I think, is that the budget's passed out of the Appropriations Committees in the House and Senate, but they basically provide none of the funding that the governor was asking for capital, as well as the $50 million for the Move On When Reading. Other bills, there are other bills, but I think I mean, those are the kind of the biggies. Are there others? There is one moving that would ease some of the requirements on how students are, ELD students are blocked after the grouping and the amount of time for which they have to be separately grouped.
The bill would empower the school district or the school board to change the 4-hour block to 2-hour block if certain proficiency measures were met. So it wouldn't just necessarily change it, it would just empower school boards to make changes. I don't really have any more details on that.
There would be certain alternatives. I'm trying to look through what else the ASBA had to say on that. I think those were, obviously the budget's the big thing for us right now.
So the House and Senate Education Committees took the week off in honor of the President's Day holiday. The rest of the legislature obviously went to work. But I do want to give an update on 2823, which is the House bill pertaining to the teacher and principal evaluations. Representative Goodale, who's the House Education Chairman, has spent about 20 hours in the past 2.5 weeks with pretty much the education stakeholders, the leaders from the different establishment groups, to take everyone's consideration, and so I don't know what that all looks like right now, so be looking for an amendment. I'll make sure to update the board as that moves. I think that it went to caucus today, and so it will probably go to the House floor next week.
The student tuition, SB 1047, is a student tuition organization bill that increases the amount of the tuition tax credit. I get a little confused because there are also ones that, there are several student tuition organization bills. Some of them increase the amount of the credit, some of them just change what it is the credit can be used for. Some of them create entirely new programs and entirely new credit. But 1047 is one that has now passed the Senate and the House. There are different versions of it, and so because of amendments in the House, and so those differences will have to be worked out generally with a conference committee or through amendments or accepting it. It goes back to the House of Origin. And the other thing is that there has been movement on TABOR, which is an acronym for so-called Taxpayer Bill of Rights. Basically, that locks in all of the cuts that have been made by the states permanently. By taking, currently there's a limit on what the state can spend. It's based on a percentage of personal income, which is basically a way of saying the state's economy. It's currently 7.41% of the state's economy. Every year, before the budget's passed, they have to figure out what our economy multiplied by 7.41% is, and that's the most that our state can spend. And there are specific, it says specifically in statute what counts toward that and what doesn't. And we're nowhere near that. We have seen a big decrease in terms of what our state spending is as a percentage of the economy over the last 3-4 years. That is something that the voters put in place over 30 years ago. What TABOR would do is take what we're spending now, which is well below our current limit on what the state's allowed to spend, and say this is it can only grow by inflation and population, which may sound reasonable to some people at first blush, but if you think of it when, for example, in Arizona where we have reservoirs and we have droughts, and think of it where some years you have a reservoir that if you said any extra water that comes in, you have to let it go through the floodgates and pass down into the river below. That works just fine as long as you continue to have lots of rainy, snowy years. But if you have a drought, we've all seen that there are reservoirs in the state that can be essentially empty. And if you then said, if you have a reservoir that has this much water left in it, you can only grow at 3% a year, and anything beyond that you have to let through the floodgates, that reservoir never comes back. So essentially that's what the attempt is with TABOR, is to take all the cuts that have been made now, lock them in, and say that we can never increase that. The other issue with inflation and population is it doesn't take into consideration the growth. Population maybe is growing at 1% a year, but if it's all kids and the schools are growing at 3% a year, or the prisons are growing at 10% a year, the things that the state funds, it doesn't really fit into that. It's been a very difficult road in Colorado, the only state where they have done this. So that's something that is progressing and is a perennial issue in our legislature.
Mm-hmm. So that didn't pass last year. Do you think that it has more viability this year, or
well,
it's coming up?
In any event, it would have to go to the voters because it's a constitutional amendment. It did pass out of approps last week on a 7-6 vote. I don't know what has happened to it since then on the floor. There are separate bills to have that are moving that would require the special hearings, for example, if the budget goes up by a certain amount, or that would require a separate vote or a supermajority of the legislature using the rules of the House and the Senate to change what budget they're allowed to consider. But I think the bill that is SCR 1030 is the one that would have to go to the voters and would, if passed, create this formula where we could never grow, basically, go back to where we were.
Matt, do you have any update on the so-called parent trigger, parent empowerment legislation?
I don't. I haven't seen that one in a while. Do you?
Okay, so all I know is that the Goldwater Institute is pushing a bill through Senator Lori Klein that would require parents, if it's 50% plus one of households in that their school is a D or an F, would go to the board and say we want to either convert into a charter, close a school, or fire the principal. Senator Cradle refused to hear it in the Education Committee, so it was moved, and I haven't followed it since it left. I don't know, but that's something you should keep an eye on. Goldwater calls it Parent Empowerment Act. The Parent Revolution, who originated the idea in California, no longer stands behind it because there's also vouchers attached or education savings accounts where now if your child is zoned for an F or a D school, they would be eligible for a voucher or savings account, whatever they call it, empowerment account. Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Matt. Future agenda items. Are there any things you would like to discuss in future meetings? Okay, we'll like to remind everyone that at our next meeting, we're going to be discussing youth and the human growth and development curriculum and our naming facilities policy. So if you have not yet provided your input to Hilda, please do so, your earliest convenience, so that we have that to work with.
I move we adjourn.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Meeting adjourned.